Sometimes how you view a record of a team is depending upon the perspective and what it represents. If you see certain teams go 7-9, it could be an indication that things are heading in the wrong direction, that this team is starting to fall apart, and that worse days are ahead. For some, it's just a continuation of a perpetual cycle of mediocrity, and then for others, it could be an indication of growth and improvement and a sign of better things to come. Now, when I think about the Minnesota Vikings and their 7-9 record in 2014, I think of the latter. I think of a team that showed me some growth, showed me some improvement under first-year head coach Mike Zimmer, that you should give Viking fans some reason for hope and optimism into the future going forward. I mean, this is a team that's not there yet, but they seem to have some of the right pieces in place, especially in key areas going forward. When you look at the Vikings, one of the things they've done in recent years, they've been really aggressive when it comes to the draft. Over the past 3 drafts, they've had a total of 7 first-round picks and a total of 8 first-round picks since 2011. That would lead you to believe that this would be a team that would have a lot of stars, a lot of big-time talents in fold, and somewhat true, somewhat not. You look at back in 2012, their second first-round pick was Harrison Smith. When healthy, this guy is a legit playmaking force in the back half of that defensive secondary. Unfortunately, their first-round pick in 2012 was 4th overall selection, Matt Khalil, and I don't need to tell anybody how bad his 2014 season was, and he hasn't really shown yet, to me anyways, that he could be a long-term franchise blindside protecting left tackle. You look at 2013, they got Xavier Rhodes, who was great, I thought, in 2014. And they had 2 other first-round picks in that first round. Sharif Floyd showed more, I think, in 2014. It probably helped having Linval Joseph on the other side of him. However, your last of the first-round picks, Cordell Patterson, hasn't really panned out. He hasn't gotten better as a route runner. I think in part some of the fault does lie on Norv Turner and that offensive staff not understanding how to better utilize him. He's a guy with size and speed. You got to figure out a way to better utilize him and utilize him to his strengths. But in 2014, this team again had 2 first-round picks. They spent their first pick, that 9th overall selection, on Anthony Barr, and he was definitely a force at linebacker at times for this Vikings organization as a rookie. And then they were able to trade back up into the bottom portion of round 1 and get who, in my mind, was the best player in the entire 2014 draft, find that franchise quarterback of the future in Teddy Bridgewater, which was important because after 2011, their 12th overall selection, Christian Ponder, proved himself not to be a franchise guy. That type of bust at that type of position can set an organization back for years, and it most certainly had with the Minnesota Vikings. However, when you can find a guy like Bridgewater, you get him at the end of round number 1, and you can sit there and look at what he did and look at his development as the 2014 season went along, as he got more comfortable and he got more familiar with the NFL level and the system of Norv Turner. You have to start to be positive about the Vikings if you're a Vikings fan, because that makes all the difference in the world. And that helps make up for the miss of Christian Ponder back in 2011 when you bring a guy like Teddy Bridgewater into the fold. Now, the Vikings in the offseason weren't nearly as active as they were the previous year, which wasn't all that surprising. They had more money to spend last offseason. They had a new head coach coming in, so he was going to want pieces that fit his system. They spent the money on guys like Captain Munnerlyn and Linval Joseph and what have you. Biggest move they made in the offseason was trading for Mike Wallace, cutting Greg Jennings. They needed more of a speed element on the outside, and I guess they thought it was worth the chance of taking on Mike Wallace and his big cap number. We'll ultimately see how that pans out. But again, this is a Minnesota Vikings team that at 7-9 has the needle pointing in the upward direction. So this is a key time. I could say it for every team, I suppose, that the NFL draft is important. And it most certainly is for the Minnesota Vikings, because this 2015 draft now, they need to be able to find some key contributors, on both sides of the ball, most notably on the offensive side of the ball, because Teddy Bridgewater is your guy now. He's going to be the franchise piece. He's the guy that you must build around. And as a result, you must learn from the mistakes of other organizations from years gone by who failed to surround their quarterbacks that they drafted high with talent on that same side of the ball. They must address the offensive side of the ball early and often in this 2015 NFL draft. In terms of their biggest needs, I look at the offensive line. It's fortunate that Bridgewater was able to do what he was able to do as a rookie, because he was under siege a lot. This was not a very good offensive line at all. Flat out. Khalil was bad. Left guard Charles Johnson was even worse. You could make an argument that offensive tackle and guard are huge needs and are potentially positions that could be addressed in the first 2 rounds of this year's draft. And if the Vikings did that, then kudos to them because those are big-time need areas. They also, I think, still need more help at wide receiver. They got some contributions out of somebody like a Charles Johnson. You haven't really gotten much out of Cordero Patterson. You did trade for somebody like a Mike Wallace, but they could still use a big type of red zone target. You could always use more, basically, is what I'm trying to get at. They could also use some depth at running back. You did draft Jerick McKinnon in the 3rd round last year. You've got that plod horse, Matt Asiata, who's better in fantasy football than he is in real life because of the goal line touches he vultures. And then you also have the situation with Adrian Peterson, which has dominated the talk a lot for the Minnesota Vikings this offseason. What AP and his agent are doing is nothing more than trying to position themselves for more guaranteed money. If you truly believe that he's that unhappy in Minnesota, if you truly believe that he wants to go somewhere else, then you're just buying into the bullshit that the media is trying to sell you, like ESPN, what have you. At the end of the day, this is all about guaranteed money. Adrian Peterson has a big cap number for 2015. He's going to get paid a lot of money. He wants to get paid a lot more money for more years. Problem for the Minnesota Vikings is they must figure out what they want to do. Adrian Peterson's 30 this year. He missed almost all of 2014. The baggage that comes with them, knowing that running backs after the age of 30 decline rapidly, how much more do you want to invest in Adrian Peterson? Is it really worth the headache anymore? This is something that has dominated the offseason for the Minnesota Vikings, and I think dominates some of their philosophy when it comes to this year's NFL draft, because you're going to have to transition now away from AP being the face of that franchise to Teddy Bridgewater. And can you do that with Adrian Peterson in the fold? Now, if the Vikings are able to sit there and trade Adrian Peterson to a team like the Cardinals or somebody and get multiple draft picks for him, then more power to him, frankly. On the flip side, Adrian Peterson is still Adrian Peterson. You would have to think he would have at least one more monster season in him. You'd like the chances of Teddy Bridgewater taking another step in his growth and development in 2015 if he had that beast to hand the ball off to 20 to 25 times a game. Now, in terms of the defensive side of the ball, you look at this team, and I think one area they've been very derelict in for years is at the linebacker position, most notably at middle linebacker. I don't think this is a position they've addressed very well. This is an area that needs to be addressed at some point in time in this draft. I think they could use another edge rusher as well. Everson Griffin played very well in 2014. Brian Robison's on the wrong side of 30. There's not a whole lot of depth there, and I think Mike Zimmer is going to want more depth on that defensive line. He's also going to want some more depth in the secondary. He brought in Captain Munnerlyn to a somewhat big money deal last year, but I think he's better suited in the nickel, in the slot type of position. You've got Xavier Rhodes on the outside. It wouldn't surprise me at all to see the Minnesota Vikings address corner somewhat early in this draft to try and really give themselves a nice 1-2 combination outside, especially knowing that you have to contend with Detroit and Calvin Johnson and Golden Tate, Green Bay with Randall Cobb, Jordy Nelson, and Devontae Adams, in Chicago with Alshon Jeffrey, Eddie Royal, and maybe a young player, a top draft pick in Chicago. And you have to build yourself to succeed in the division, and in order to do that, you have to be able to defend some of these great wide receivers you're going to face multiple times a year in the NFC North. In terms of their overall draft philosophy, the Minnesota Vikings, I don't think have to be bound to any one thing. I would prefer to see them, if I'm a Vikings fan, address that offensive line multiple times in this draft with maybe a round 1 pick, maybe even a round 3 or 4 pick as well, one at tackle and one at guard, because that help is needed. And at the end of the day, Bridgewater is the identity, the face of your franchise. You must protect him. You must get better in pass protection in 2015 than you were in 2014. So that would be a way to go. I wouldn't be that surprised, though, to see the Minnesota Vikings spend a first-round pick at number 11 on a defensive player, either some type of young edge rusher that they could line up at different places, or a corner. A guy that makes a ton of sense to me for them if he's there is Trey Waynes from Michigan State. Here's a guy that's 6 foot. Here's a guy that can run. Here's a guy who seems to have all the skills to at least be a very, very good NFL corner. And the thought of him and Xavier Rhodes on opposite sides in the secondary for years to come has to be exciting to that Vikings organization. The good thing is, though, for the Minnesota Vikings, they found their quarterback, and it opens up the potential for so many possibilities for so many different things. Now the key thing is, though, is to build around that young quarterback. If they can do that and they can find him some helps in some way, shape, or form during different portions of the 2015 NFL draft, this is a Vikings organization that we're going to have to take a lot more seriously heading into that 2015 season.